Good evening. Oh, that's live. Hi, I'm Dr. Andrew Morgan. I'm the director of the Hendricks Choir, and thank you all so much for being here. I wanted to just open tonight with a few remarks that I think are appropriate given the nature of our program tonight. Normally I don't write out all of my notes word for word, but in this case I wanted to. Many of you have heard that tonight's performance represents something beyond the traditional choral concert. Perhaps you knew beforehand that we had titled the program Down Deep, Oppression, Reconciliation, and Justice, or that the choir tonight is presenting a world premiere piece. But even if you weren't aware of these things ahead of time, you can plainly see right now that our stage is not set up with risers or a piano, and that the students are not currently waiting to enter from the side of the stage. We'll get there in a bit, though. The first part of our evening tonight, rather, is about dialogue, about acknowledging some truths from our past and evaluating the legacy of those involved in a landmark event in our country's history and the ongoing effort to ensure equality for all people. I'm so pleased to be joined for this discussion by my distinguished colleagues, who I'll introduce in a bit. My hope is that this conversation tonight and the music that we perform after it will help us all reflect a little bit on how this history has impacted our own lives and the ways that we understand some of the challenges we face in society today. The central theme of this program and the discussion we're about to have examines the legacy of and the impact of the 1957 desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. The past 3 years since I came to Hendricks, I've had the pleasure of visiting Little Rock Central many times, working with their students, collaborating with their choir director, and welcoming singers from that program into the Hendricks Choir. You'll hear several of them tonight. From these experiences, I've become aware of the pride this community feels regarding its historical significance, and I felt it was appropriate to incorporate that somehow into a program performed by the Hendricks Choir. In 2015, I began a lengthy discussion over the course of many months with a composer from Indiana University, Dominic DiOrio, whose music I had long admired. When he and I began considering ideas for a new work to be premiered by the Hendricks Choir, I was stunned in the best possible way when he suggested writing a work that honors the Little Rock Nine, those first students to enter a newly desegregated Central High School. The rest of the program that we designed around that speaks to the role of music as a force for social change and different ways that we've seen social justice manifested around the world. I'm also very pleased tonight to be joined not only by our panelists, but also by a guest conductor, Dr. J.D. Burnett from the University of Georgia. He brings a wealth of experience in choral music and looking at unique ways of programming to speak to issues of social change, and I look forward to incorporating him into our discussion. So now, our other honored guest tonight that we have. Liz Lundeen teaches the Foundations of Education course in the Education Department here at Hendricks. She has a Master of Philosophy and Historical Studies from Cambridge University and is a PhD candidate in history at the University of North Carolina, where she is writing a dissertation entitled Brick and Mortar, Historically Black Colleges and the Struggle for Equality 1930 to 1960. She is a specialist in African American education and civil rights. She's also a trained historian and has served, a trained oral historian, and has served as a research associate for the Civil Rights History Project, a collaboration between the Southern Oral History Program, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Our next guest is Dr. Dion Jackson. She is Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at the college. In this role, she serves as the Chief Diversity Officer and leads the college's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The Chief Diversity Officer provides leadership for strategic planning and programming that advances the diversity mission and works to foster an accepting and welcoming campus climate. She's also an Associate Professor of Education and serves as the Principal Investigator of Hendricks' 5-year, $1.1 million National Science Foundation grant that funds Hendricks NSTED, a program that recruits, develops, and supports outstanding Hendricks science and mathematics majors to become teachers in the Arkansas Delta. She has a Doctor of Education degree from Baylor University, a Master of Science in Education from University of Central Arkansas, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Biology from right here at Hendricks. Dr. Jay Barth is the Emmy, and I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, the Emmy and Ima Graves Peace Professor of Politics and Bill and Connie Odyssey Professor and Director of Civic Engagement Projects at Hendricks College. There we go. Dr. Barth's academic work includes research on the politics of the South, state governments and politics, LGBT politics, political communication, particularly radio advertising, and the achievement gap in Arkansas. He is the co-author of the second edition of Arkansas Politics and Government, Do the People Rule, published in 2005. A member of the Department of Politics and International Relations since 1994, Barth was named Arkansas Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and for the Council for Advancement and Support of Education in 2007, and in 2014 was named winner of the Southern Political Science Association's Diane Blair Award for Congressional Fellowship and from the American Political Science Association, and has served on the staff of the late U.S. Senator from Minnesota, Paul Wellstone. I'm so pleased to have these individuals here. I'm going to sit down now. I got in touch with all of these individuals because I thought that they could bring a unique perspective to looking at the history of Little Rock Central High School. And so I gave them some questions ahead of time. They've prepared some remarks, and then this will, I think, foster a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to start with Dr. Barth. Jay, one of the questions that I posed to you was wondering what kind of context you could give us in terms of understanding the political landscape of Arkansas at the time of the 1957 desegregation. Who were some of the important political players, and how did their roles help to either advance or hinder the desegregation of schools in Arkansas?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks so much for having us this evening. And of course, some of the folks who I cannot see in this room know some of this history quite well, but I'll run through it because I think it's important to contextualize the piece that we're going to see later. After the Brown rulings in 1954 and 1955, the powers that be in Little Rock, both the superintendent and the Little Rock School Board, moved forward with a careful plan of desegregation. It was very methodical. It was very slow, but it would begin, of course, in the fall of 1957 at the high school level in one high school, and then over time, which would move down to the junior high and then to the elementary level. And that's kind of classic Little Rock elite politics in terms of doing things carefully, doing things slowly, but still making some progress. And Little Rock, while like all southern cities at that time, while deeply embedded in a Jim Crow culture, Little Rock had shown some moderation on other issues, including bus desegregation, and had willingly gone along, although in a slow way, with change. The carefully selected students who were first a larger number and then, of course, reduced to 9, were ready to begin school just after Labor Day in 1957, and that is when Governor Faubus announced that the students would be blocked from entering in the interest of, quote-unquote, public safety in the community. And Faubus himself, a fascinating guy who had himself been a relative racial progressive, said first off that was his public reason, but I think it's also clear that there was a political reason. And Roy Reed, his biographer, really says it was all about politics, is that he was seeing himself threatened from the political right by segregationist politicians who had a lot of talent and were riding the tidal wave of segregation, and he was himself getting ready to run for a third term as governor, which was fairly unprecedented in Arkansas, and he knew it was going to be tough unless he got out there on this issue. And I think we all know the basic series of events that followed that over the weeks that came, with, of course, the failed efforts to desegregate initially, the kind of half-day desegregation that occurred a few days after that, and then the threats of violence that ensued around those events. And then finally, of course, President Eisenhower sending in the 101st Airborne to create the reality of desegregation for those nine students. I think, just as importantly, while that year carried out in 1957 and 1958, the Cooper versus Aaron decision by the Supreme Court in the fall of 1958, another crucial step in terms of the U.S. Supreme Court saying that states are bound to follow the rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court. And really that 1-2 punch of the executive branch, President Eisenhower saying, we're going to make this happen, the Supreme Court saying, yes, you got to follow the Supreme Court rulings when it comes to the Equal Protections Clause, I mean, I think really did help to bring to life that Equal Protections Clause, which had been a piece of paper for a century, or nearly a century, and was really finally brought to light brought to life through that combination. Immediately following that Supreme Court decision, Governor Faubus closes the schools, as he was empowered to do, and there followed the so-called lost year, in which public schools ceased to exist for the most part in the city of Little Rock. There were some feeble efforts at some public television, things like that, and some interesting stories. But following the purge of a flurry of teachers and administrators who supported moving forward with desegregation, the Little Rock business community pushed for a recall of the militant segregationist on the school board, and the schools did reopen in the fall of 1959. And what began to happen in the years that followed was slow, minimal desegregation for the years that followed, and partly the courts didn't push it any further. And also, it's important to recognize that the Little Rock School District did not continue to grow to the west as especially white, more affluent citizens moved to the west, moved out into western Little Rock, stayed in the city of Little Rock, but they were now part of an overwhelmingly white Pulaski County Special School District, and that was the reality that grew up for the decades that came. And, you know, it's, I think, fascinating that Judge Henry Wood's words are in this piece tonight, because it was really his ruling in 1985 where he said initially that all of the three school districts in Pulaski County should merge into one, that ultimately was mostly overturned by the Eighth Circuit. I think a really crucial moment in this history of Little Rock, because that ruling in the mid-1980s really led to the proliferation of private schools in the Little Rock area, and really led to this really fast movement of white flight out into the suburban districts. And I know Dr. Jackson's going to talk some more about the rest of that story a little bit later.
Yeah, there we go. So now we're going to move down. Liz, when we were chatting earlier, one of the questions I posed to you was what you could maybe shed a little bit light about regarding the civil rights movement in Arkansas, besides Little Rock Central High School. What else was happening in the civil rights movement on a social grassroots level? And this whole talk about school desegregation, how did that play out elsewhere in the country? Was that, was the conflict limited to places like Little Rock Central High School, or were we seeing this in other cities and states as well?
Thank you. I will start by just briefly answering that last question. Little Rock is by no means exceptional in terms of this history. It just happened to be the first massively followed, nationally televised showdown of the conflict between those who wished to enforce the court's ruling from Brown v. Board and those who hoped to resist it. And, we can get into some of those specific cases of different cities if we choose to later in some of the follow-up questions. But what I kind of wanted to do as well is branch out a bit and talk about the connection, the context for the Little Rock desegregation and some of the national forces that are at play in terms of the civil rights movement that certainly took hold in Arkansas as well as in other states throughout the South. So I think we can learn a number of lessons from the Little Rock crisis in terms of this history. It illustrates the extent to which white Southerners were willing to go to preserve segregation. It shows us that the Little Rock Nine, regardless of their youth and their impeccable characters, were not immune from the violence and vitriol inflicted on black lives during the Jim Crow South. But I want to suggest as well that the Little Rock crisis reveals that the movement to desegregate schools and to secure equal rights required a variety of battles fought on multiple fronts, on multiple levels, and using multiple tactics. And as an example of this, I'll highlight the interplay between the work being done at the national level by civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the grassroots work being done at the local level in places like Little Rock to fully realize the victories won in the courts. And so to back up and say the legal work rather being done by the NAACP quite literally laid the groundwork for what was able to take place in Little Rock for the desegregation at Central High School. Since the mid-1930s, the NAACP had been building up a legal strategy, a campaign to achieve racial equality in education. In the 1930s and 1940s, it had initiated a series of lawsuits intended to equalize conditions among black and white schools. And after World War II, the NAACP shifted to a strategy aimed at the heart of segregation, at getting that Plessy v. Ferguson precedent of separate but equal overturned, and to declare segregation on its face to be unconstitutional, to breathe life into the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Of course, the culmination of all of this is the Brown v. Board decision, which said that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. But if Brown marks the culmination of that legal campaign fought for by the NAACP to secure educational opportunities, it is the beginning of another struggle entirely to actually achieve the desegregation of public schools. And so I think that's where we get to the local level of this battle in places like Little Rock, where we have ordinary citizens risking their lives and or livelihoods to test the compliance of these new laws, to force the implementation of the NAACP's legal work on the ground. So as they prepared to desegregate, the Little Rock Nine were, whether they were conscious of it or not, standing on the shoulders of young African Americans who had come before them. They were continuing in the footsteps of other black Arkansans, young people like Silas Hunt and Edith May Irby, who desegregated the University of Arkansas's law school and medical school in 1948. Each of these individuals took extraordinary risks to serve as pioneers or foot soldiers in the civil rights movement to secure equal citizenship in their education, all while trying to do the very ordinary thing, right, of going to school and getting access to an education. And in this regard, they shared much in common with other participants in the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders who tested segregation in interstate travel, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, who refused to ride on segregated city buses, and college students throughout the South who insisted on being served at segregated lunch counters a decade later or a few years later. Of course, we know that the process of desegregating the schools in Little Rock would take decades. More. It would require more additional litigation, by the NAACP, and I'm sure we can talk about that in due course. But I'll end here just emphasizing the point that the desegregation of Central High School, just like the civil rights movement as a whole, could not have succeeded without both the organizational and legal work performed at the national level by organizations like the NAACP and the work of local people, the Little Rock Nine, who are willing to force compliance from the grassroots.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson. So something we had talked about was, we are now 60 years down the road from this. How are school segregation issues still playing out? What's the impact of this in the long term, and in what ways has, in the few years after the decision happened and the desegregation took place, but also in the decades since, what sort of issues regarding racial equality in Arkansas schools, and really this is going to turn to part of the larger discussion on a national level, what sort of issues do we still see regarding segregation and equality in schools, both in Little Rock and the state and beyond?
Thank you for that question. I think when we begin to think about what's happening in Little Rock schools, even then and up to now, I think there's a key difference when we think about equality and their desire for resources that were equal to other individuals' resources, whether it is getting new school books just like other kids did, or having the equipment and supplies that other schools had. But it begins to transition into this debate about equity. And so I think as we see over the last 6 decades the changes that have happened, our fight for the needs of schools, children in public schools, has become one of not having necessarily access to the same things other people have access to, but really thinking about equity. And we see that some branching out in different ways, whether it's with students with disabilities also, and thinking about equitable access to education, thinking about ESL students and their need for equitable access to education. And so when I particularly think of minority students in our public schools, particularly in Little Rock, as a product of Little Rock Public Schools, when I think about the 90s and the 80s when I was a student in Little Rock Public Schools and think about how they differ now, I see equity really playing a role in the needs that still exist. For me, it comes about as an educator, thinking about the gaps that exist, both demographically in our schools. Dr. Barth and I were talking about this earlier, how we see this shift. I vividly remember being a student in the 70s and 80s in the Little Rock schools, and about 50% of our students in the schools were majority students and 50% minority. But now I spend time in Little Rock Public Schools, and you see the dramatic shift where there's about 20 to 25% of the students in the schools as majority and the other as minority. And so we see this demographic shift, which points to what Dr. Barth mentions about the trends for white flight in the Little Rock School District, some of the demographics of Little Rock, and really thinking about how our city limits have expanded, but our public school district zoning has not expanded out, and the effects that that has, not building out into West Little Rock. And so we see this becoming an equity issue more so. Even when I think about across the state and going into rural counties in the state of Arkansas, still thinking about equity issues. I think some would argue, though, in some of those smaller districts, there are some equality issues there, too. Because I see when I talk to school teachers who have $100 as a science teacher to do labs for the entire year versus a larger public school where they have access to thousands of dollars, just that equality of making sure resources are spread in our state in a way in which there's still equal access to resources, but thinking about those equity issues. I still see those today.
In the piece of music by Dominic DiOrio that you're going to hear, the first and last movements borrow from the same text, a 1985 interview with Judge Henry Woods from the New York Times. Not being an Arkansan, this was a story that I knew very, very little about. Well, in fact, that I did not know about, that there were ongoing litigation, legal issues surrounding the issues of segregation and structure in the Little Rock schools, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the story and the significance and how public opinion about that case has, what that opinion was at the time and how that's evolved since then, because I think that's a piece of this history that's sort of a second chapter that I would love to know more about, and I bet others would too.
So, obviously Little Rock, like most of the big urban cities, urban centers in the South, and then the rest of the country began busing within districts in the 1970s. But Little Rock, for the reason as ways that Dion has described, it was difficult to create true desegregation, full integration in the community because of so much white flight that had already begun to occur to these surrounding districts, both the Little Rock district, the North Little Rock district, and then the Pulaski County Special School District, which served as something of a donut around North Little Rock and Little Rock. And so, Judge Woods became convinced that the only way that white kids and kids of color were really going to sit next to each other in every school, in that every classroom in that community was if there was county-wide desegregation. And it was incredibly controversial. It was seen as almost an attack on property rights for folks who had invested in these homes in these more suburban neighborhoods that where part of the decision was guided by a desire to choose a local school. And this ruling had the potential to really truly upset that dynamic, and it truly did create the proliferation of white flight and private schooling during that period. Now, as it turned out, the Eighth Circuit mostly overturned it, but it did change the district lines in a way that did lead to a more heavily African-American Little Rock school district. But that was his goal, and I was actually having coffee this morning with somebody totally unconnected to this who said, he had it right. If that step, as painful as it would have been in the short run, had been stuck, if we had stuck with it, that maybe we'd be in a different spot now. I think that's a big debate, because I think some folks would say, well, we'd be in a different spot, but with just even more kids in private schools and in the surrounding school districts. I think it's a great debate, but it clearly was deeply consequential in terms of reshaping the future of Little Rock.
It seems to me like part of the current debate about school choice and vouchers plays into this story, into this narrative of do we want our children to be going to school in their neighborhoods, in their communities, or do we want them to have the ability to potentially go elsewhere and pursue that wish on their own? So how can we wed those two conflicting stories, those two ideas that we have? On one hand, this desire to create equality and equity for everyone in society through public education and ensuring that everybody has the access to the same high quality education, but at the same time, we now have people that are saying that can perhaps hinder opportunity for some, and that the ability to exercise free choice and be educated where you want to is an equally valid point. I mean, how does that issue, how do we tie that in with our kind of our history and knowledge of Little Rock Central?
I think that's the million-dollar question, that if there was a very good answer to it, we would all be millionaires. But historically, I want to go back to a point in thinking about my own family's history, because my mother is a '66 graduate of Horace Mann, which was the first African-American high school and only one built in Little Rock, and was developed to transition black students from Dunbar junior high and senior high to that high school. And I've often had conversations with her and her older siblings, who all attended Horace Mann in Dunbar, about whether they had a desire to go to Central High or to be integrated. And so I think that history kind of helps me in answering that question, because often they talk about the great joy and pleasure they found in being educated together with the community of folks that they knew, and how socially it was difficult for them to think about what integration would do for them as a community of blacks, because they were all very familiar with each other from where they lived, from the churches they went to, the social circles they were in. And so there was some great fear on their end about that. And my uncle talks to me about that a lot as far as being the oldest sibling. And so I think about that now as a student who was bused. I was raised in West Little Rock, but at the height of desegregation for the Little Rock schools in the 80s with magnet schools, and I went out to East Little Rock to Horace Mann, where my mom went to high school. And it was interesting being there and being bused as an African American with the thought of knowing that many people were thinking about busing out to East Little Rock to get more white students there. And so for me, I vividly remember years of being educated with folks in my community when that 50-50 balance existed, when there was that demographic within the communities that we lived in, but I have lived where I've seen white flight occur. And even I'm living where I see even middle class and upper middle class blacks coming out of the district. And so it's interesting to see that and think about school choice, because I think school choice, when we talk about segregation and desegregation, now when we look at it more, it's about income. And I see that a lot. When I go into schools, I see populations of students who can afford to do things, or parents who have been educated enough to make those choices for their kids, versus those who do not have the resources that others do. And so I think that becomes a difficult question, because who's equipping everyone to know what are the best choices for their kids, and how are we equipping them to do that? And who's standing up for those individuals who do not understand how to make appropriate choices, or who to go to help them to make appropriate choices? And I think that's when school choice becomes an issue, really. Because in Little Rock, we're living with and thinking about the influence of charter schools in particular on our school district. And so that's access, free access to school choice for individuals. But in Little Rock, we struggle with that access because there's a lack of transportation often to those charter schools. And so there's a lot that we have to work through to think about how to effectively make school choice work if that's the direction we want to go. And I think it's a good question for being here in Conway, where there's not as much school choice existing here. And I'm in the schools here, and I see the diversity that exists there, both socioeconomically and among race. But I see how they've worked to make a school system work well and serve all students. And so there are a lot of mixed views about school choice and the effects that they can have on communities.
This is a question for anyone. In reading a little bit about Little Rock Central, and I'm backing up now more to the events around 1957, when 10 years ago, when we were in 2007, for the 50th anniversary of this event, there was a number of papers and books and chapters and essays published about how we kind of frame this now. And one compelling essay that I looked at, and I apologize that I can't remember who the author was. He was a historian at University of Georgia, actually, where Dr. Burnett teaches, said that one of the issues that we get into with history, especially with something like this that ties so much into collective memory and social change, is that the history tends to account for the choices and the actions of those in power, of the politicians and the elites and those who are making the decisions. But history doesn't always account for how it was experienced by the people that lived it, the people on the streets, the people in the classroom, the family of the nine students even. So that's where I'm going. I mean, how do we look at the social impact of this at its time and since then as well? Not just the political and legal ramifications.
Well, as an oral historian, I think that going to the people who lived it is certainly part of the solution, and I'm really excited to hear the piece tonight because it uses the testimonies of people who quite intimately lived this history. And, you know, historians love to look in archives. They love to look at documents and things that have been written down in the official record. But that's why we have tools and methods like oral histories and going to people and interviewing them and asking them about their lived experience as an antidote to that official record. I think if you look at oral histories of people who experienced school desegregation, you'll see narratives of nostalgia for black schools, for black teachers who lost their jobs, for those institutions that were casualties of school desegregation. I think you'll also see, I'm thinking particularly of Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a successful example of school desegregation making use of busing. Students there who went to school in the late 60s and early 70s speak volumes about the values of racial diversity they lived, they experienced and acquired by going to school in a diverse classroom. So I think that's certainly part of the solution, is to write histories that make use of people's lived experiences themselves.
For the sake of time, I think we're going to wrap this up shortly. I wanted to turn things over to Dr. Burnett for a minute. We're talking a lot about history here. You're at a choir concert, so how do we make sense of these two very disparate disciplines, as it were? So I want to talk a little bit about the concert, about the repertoire that we're going to do, so we can make sense out of the music when we hear it. This piece that you're going to hear, I'll talk a little bit about this first, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the other repertoire as well. Dominic DiIorio's piece uses quotes from 4 of the Little Rock Nine. These are all listed in your program, but I'll just mention them really quickly because I think that they're very powerful. Minna Jean Brown Trickey, in the second movement, she writes, or she said, I should say, I was one of the kids approved by the school officials. One girl ran up to me and said, "I'm so glad you're here. Won't you go to lunch with me today?" I never saw her again. And we move on with Carlotta Walls Lanier. I had to have that sheet of paper. It was an achievement. I helped change the educational system. The fourth movement, which you'll hear, is very much the crowd scene. It evokes the most sense of terror as these students are moving up and they're being approached by these angry mobs. Elizabeth Eckford writes, "They moved closer and closer. Somebody started yelling. I tried to see a friendly face, someone who maybe could help. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face, but when I looked at her again, she spat on me." The fifth movement, I was from Thelma Mother Shed Ware. I was determined to treat my kids equally. I taught white kids, helped them, graded them fairly. Dominic had some really interesting remarks about this movement. The theme in this one from Thelma is that she was determined that she was going to be very, very equal in the way that she treated her children. And when she was teaching that these issues about race, she tried to be as blind to them as she could. He uses a musical canon in writing this movement where everyone is singing the same melody, and it creates an amazing sense of consistency, almost a lack of subjectivity in the music, which fits very, very well with that theme of equal treatment and fair rule for all. And then he closes, as I said, the whole work closes with Judge Henry Wood's words, but he selectively leaves some out. So in the first movement, you might recall that Judge Woods said, "Down deep, many whites don't want their kids sitting next to blacks." That's what it comes to. That's from his 1985 New York Times interview. And then at the end, Dominic takes out just a few words and radically changes the meaning of it so that all we get now is down deep, whites sitting next to blacks. That's what it comes to. That for Dominic, that's sort of the core that we're trying to reach, is some sort of a world where there's the ability to have dialogue and conversation about these things, and to work and sit together and share common experiences with people from different backgrounds, and to create a society where that's possible for everyone. I hope you really, really enjoy that work. Dr. Burnett, why don't you share a little bit of insight about some of the works that you're conducting, because we go back and forth, and you'll get more out of it if you hear from him now.
Sure. There are a few pieces that open the program that celebrate music in their texts. Let Music Fill the Air, and then Earth Song, which is one that I'll conduct. There's a line in there that says, "Music and singing shall be my refuge, and music and singing will be my light." And I think that really aptly sums up the role of the arts, and specifically music, in sort of marking society and a culture, and the trials and the successes of any society as a sort of shadow, sometimes very obvious and sometimes quiet and private reflections upon the realities that we experience as human beings as we wrestle with these huge ideas about how we treat one another. Then we move through Dominic DiIorio's piece and follow that with 3 pieces that are in some ways related, in some ways quite different. The spiritual, the African American spiritual, which may be the only truly American art form, in terms of music. In some ways it's the most indigenous music that we have that really came from this country. Oddly, but very specifically and purposefully, this one was arranged, this Steal Away tune, which is a really well-known spiritual, was arranged by Michael Tippett, who is a Brit, a white person. And it's used along with 4 other spirituals as a point of punctuation in a larger work that he wrote called A Child of Our Time, which was a work that sort of chronicled the series of events that led up to World War II, both in Germany and in France. And so he uses these American spirituals to punctuate. And this comes from a long tradition of music. Bach did the same thing in the Passions of Christ, using chorales to the traditional Lutheran hymns to punctuate, to reflect, to bring everybody in, and to sort of take care of the listener who is hearing a really tough story. And I think that it's a really conscious decision on the part of a composer to use these things. Following that is another American tune, Light of a Clear Blue Morning by Dolly Parton, arranged by Craig Hella Johnson, who is an American conductor and singer and composer-arranger, which provides a little bit of hope to the program, that has a lot of heaviness to it. I think this program is one that confronts a lot of ideas that are uncomfortable and tricky and hard to wrestle with, and this one kind of points us in the direction of that just emerging light on the horizon that we kind of all just try to track down, just always try and point, as we try to do well by each other and do well by ourselves, we're just looking due north, or maybe in this case due east, toward the light of a clear blue morning, just trying to find that refreshing hope at the end of the day. And then MLK, a piece by U2, what more famous band in the world probably, to celebrate Martin Luther King and expressing a wish that the life's work that was so consequential in our society be continuous and live on past him, and wishing him sleep while we continue to do the tough, nitty-gritty work that needs to be done here in this country.
There are two other really short pieces in the program that precede Dominic's work that I forgot to mention, from Estonia. And I chose those for a very important reason. Estonia is one of the Baltic countries that in the 1980s amassed a completely peaceful revolution against the communist government that was achieved almost entirely through mass demonstrations of singing. It is often referred to quite literally as the singing revolution. They still hold every year massive song festivals with hundreds of thousands of people getting together. You have choirs of 10 to 20,000 people singing songs together. And there's this vibrant and rich tradition of really, really moving and simple in a way, but in a simple but profound manner of speaking to human experience and the power of music to achieve social change. So I hope you enjoy those two as well. We're going to break for a short intermission as we reset the stage. I just want to take an opportunity to thank again my panelists for their time and expertise. Thank you. So we have some special students that I would like to acknowledge. This is the final concert for our seniors, and I thought it was a fitting opportunity for us to acknowledge them, invite them to come up, and we're going to give them a thunderous round of applause. This class, the seniors, were freshmen when I came down to Hendrix for the first time, and some of them I met when I was here on campus. And it's been really, really fun for me and gratifying to see them grow and develop as adults and as students and as whole people, which I think is something that they all do really, really remarkably well. Choir takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and students at Hendrix are already working very, very hard at what they do. And so for these students to give so much time, so many semesters after semester, and dress rehearsals, and 4 hours per week of this class that they get, a lot of mental work that they have to do on top of everything else that they have is really a feat. But they have been committed and wonderful and hardworking, and a treat for me to have in this class. So I would like to invite them to come forward, and if they would all just line up right here next to me, that would be wonderful. Sydney Hickok. Kara Schwab. Bridget Yelk. Grace Griffin. Elizabeth Stapper. Kelsey Williams. Ryan Spainhour. And Ian McVinney. So on behalf of all of the choir members and myself, thank you for your years of service. Please, as I said tonight before you came out here for the concert, don't stop singing when you leave here. Choral music is best done when you do it for a lifetime. So keep at it. You're all wonderfully talented and great people, and I'll miss you, and thank you all so much. Let's give another applause. Just a final round of thank yous to all the students for their wonderful musicianship and hard work getting ready for tonight. Thanks to my great collaborative pianist, Tim Allen, back there. Bravo, sir. And to my colleague down here, Dr. J.D. Burnett. Thank you very much, sir. And a big thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you join us after tonight's concert is done next door in Trishman for a reception.